They say that time heals all wounds, but in the small, forgotten corners of the Midwest, time doesn't heal.
他在
It
等我
just
吗？
covers things in dust. Elias was 16 years old when the world first told him he didn't belong. It wasn't a shouted argument or a dramatic exit. It was the sound of a suitcase zipping shut and the cold, clinical click of a social worker's car door. In a town where everyone's lineage was written in the local cemetery, Elias was a ghost. An orphan with no name to lean on and no soil to call his own. But his grandfather, a man the town called Old Silas the Iceman, had left him one final thing. Not a house, not a bank account. He left him the ice house, a relic of a world before electricity, a giant wooden box designed to keep things frozen when the world was burning up. The neighbors laughed. They stood on their porches, coffee mugs steaming in their hands, watching the orphan boy struggle with the heavy iron keys. "It's a pile of sawdust and rot, Elias," they'd shout. "Sell the wood for scrap and get a real job at the mill." But Elias remembered his grandfather's hands. They weren't the hands of a man who kept junk. They were the hands of a man who kept secrets. As Elias stepped into the darkness, the smell hit him, not of rot, but of ancient cedar and deep, deep cold. The ice house shouldn't have been cold. It had been abandoned for 40 years. Yet as he touched the inner wall, his fingers went numb. He wasn't just standing in a building. He was standing in a vault. And the modern world, with its neon lights and fast cars, had no idea what Silas had been cooling for nearly half a century. For the first 3 weeks, Elias didn't find anything but work. He spent his days shoveling out tons of petrified sawdust, the insulation of a bygone era. His hands bled. His back ached with a rhythmic, pulsing fire. Every night he slept on the floor of that frozen cathedral, wrapped in a moth-eaten wool blanket, listening to the town outside. He could hear the developers. Men in expensive suits who parked their black SUVs at the edge of the property. They wanted the land. They wanted to tear down the eyesore and build a strip mall. They offered him $500 to sign it away. "You're an orphan, kid," the lead developer, a man named Miller, told him. "You don't have a lawyer. You don't even have a last name that matters. Take the money and go find a life somewhere else." Elias stopped. The silence in the ice house suddenly felt heavy, like the weight of an ocean. He hadn't found scrap wood. He had found a lead-sealed container, buried 6 feet under the frost line. As he cleared the lid, he realized it wasn't a chest at all. It was an industrial-grade refrigeration canister, the kind used by the government during the war. But what was an Iceman doing with a high-security vault? He reached for the handle, but his hand trembled. He realized that once he opened this, he could never go back to being the nothing boy the town expected him to be. He was about to find out that his grandfather didn't just sell ice to the neighbors. He was the guardian of something the neighbors would have killed to possess. The seal didn't just break, it exhaled. A hiss of pressurized nitrogen, a cold breath from 80 years ago, brushed against Elias' face, carrying the scent of ozone and old, expensive paper. Inside the canister sat a leather-bound ledger, wrapped in oilcloth, and beneath it, a series of glass vials nestled in a bed of wool. They weren't filled with gold or diamonds. They were filled with something much rarer in the eyes of a man like Silas. Seeds. But these weren't ordinary seeds you'd find at a local co-op. They were labeled in a meticulous, cramped handwriting that Elias recognized from the few birthday cards he'd ever received. Black Mountain Wheat, extinct 1941, read one. Great Plains Blue Stem, original strain, read another. To understand why a man would bury a
他
biological
在等
vault
我吗？
beneath 6 feet of frozen sawdust, Elias had to look back to the winter of 1944, the year the Great Freeze nearly broke the spine of the county. In those days, Silas wasn't the old Iceman. He was a young man with a vision that extended far beyond the local pond. While the rest of the world was looking toward the war in Europe, Silas was looking at the soil of his own backyard. He had seen the dust bowls of the previous decade. He had seen how the modern farming techniques, the heavy chemicals and the monocropping, were stripping the life out of the earth. He knew that one day, the world would wake up and realize it had traded its heritage for a quick harvest. He began to travel. On his old Indian motorcycle, Silas rode from the Appalachian foothills to the edge of the Rockies, visiting the old-timers who still planted by the moon and saved their seeds in mason jars under their beds. He was a collector of ghosts. He sought out the grains that the big agricultural companies had declared obsolete. He sought out the fruits that didn't ship well but tasted like heaven. And as the war intensified and the government began to seize control of the food supply, Silas realized that if he didn't hide these treasures, they would be lost to the corporate machine forever. The ice house became his fortress. Under the cover of his legitimate ice-cutting business, Silas was building a genetic library. He used the natural cooling properties of the massive structure, combined with early industrial refrigeration parts he'd scavenged from a decommissioned naval yard, to create a time capsule of life. But Silas had a rival, a man named Silas Miller Sr., the grandfather of the developer currently trying to buy Elias out. Miller Sr. was a man of progress. He wanted the county to sign exclusive contracts with the chemical giants. He saw Silas's seed saving as a threat to the new order. In the winter of '44, the tension boiled over. The town council, led by Miller, accused Silas of hoarding resources. They didn't know about the seeds. They thought he was hiding fuel or silver. They raided the ice house. Silas stood at the door with a double-barreled shotgun, his eyes as cold as the blocks he hauled. He didn't fire a shot, but the look in his eyes stopped them cold. He told them, "You can take the land when I'm dead, but as long as I breathe, what's inside this house belongs to the future, not to you." He was branded a recluse, a crank, a man who chose a cold building over his own neighbors. He spent the next 40 years in self-imposed exile, watching the town change around him. He watched as the Miller family grew rich on the very chemicals Silas warned would fail. He watched as the soil turned to gray dust, and he waited. He waited for a descendant who would have the strength to shovel through the sawdust of history. Back in the present, the sun was beginning to set, casting long, bruised shadows across the floor of the ice house. Elias sat on the edge of the open vault, the 1944 ledger in his lap. He realized now that he wasn't just an orphan. He was the guardian of a multi-billion-dollar inheritance that couldn't be spent at a bank. If he came forward with these seeds, the scientific community would hail it as the find of the century. The agricultural giants would pay any price to destroy them or to own them. But if he stayed silent, he was just a kid in a drafty building with a pile of old glass. The sound of a car door slamming snapped him back to reality. He looked through the cracks in the wooden siding. Miller's black SUV was back. This time he wasn't alone. He had 2 men with him carrying clipboards and measuring tapes. They didn't even knock. They walked onto the porch of the ice house as if they already owned the air inside it. "Elias," Miller's voice boomed, echoing through the hollow wood.
他在等我吗？
The city council just signed the emergency demolition order. This structure is a fire hazard. You have 1 hour to clear out your personal belongings before the dozers arrive. Elias felt the familiar panic of the nothing boy. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He looked at the vault. He looked at the ledger. He thought about his grandfather standing in this very spot in 1944. Silas hadn't had a law degree or a bank account either. He only had the truth. Elias stood up. He didn't grab his suitcase. He grabbed the heavy iron key. He walked to the doors and pushed them open. The 3 men on the porch stopped. Miller smiled, a predatory, thin-lipped grin. "Sensible boy, step aside and let the professionals handle this." "The ice house isn't for sale," Elias said. His voice was quiet, but it didn't shake. And it's not a fire hazard. It's a registered historical repository. I found the deed's original codicil in the vault, Mr. Miller. My grandfather didn't just leave me the building. He left me the sovereign status of the land under the 1938 Agricultural Heritage Act. Miller's face went pale. The men with the clipboards looked at each other. They knew that act. It was an obscure piece of legislation designed to protect family seed banks during the Depression. It meant the city couldn't touch the land as long as the biological purpose of the site was being maintained. "You're bluffing," Miller hissed, stepping closer. "You're a 16-year-old ward of the state. You don't know the first thing about the law." "I know my grandfather," Elias replied. "And I know that your family has been trying to bury what's in this building for 80 years. But the frost is over, Mr. Miller. The seeds are still alive. And so am I." The days that followed the confrontation on the porch were not filled with the sound of bulldozers, but with a far more dangerous weapon: silence. Miller didn't return with the police, and he didn't bring the wrecking ball. Instead, the town's atmospheric pressure seemed to shift. Elias found that the local grocer wouldn't look him in the eye when he bought his meager supplies of bread and milk. The water to the ice house was mysteriously cut off by the utility board for a supposed leak that didn't exist. The small-town machinery was grinding against him, trying to starve the orphan out of the fortress he had claimed. But Elias had the ledger, and in the ledger he found a map. Silas hadn't just saved seeds. He had mapped out a test plot in the high-acreage back corner of the property, a patch of land that had been chemically fallow for 40 years, protected by a dense thicket of old-growth briars. Under the cover of a moonless Tuesday night, Elias began his work. He didn't have a tractor. He didn't have a plow. He had a hand trowel and a bucket of water he had hauled from the creek half a mile away. He cleared the briars until his forearms were a map of scratches and dried blood. He dug into the gray, compacted earth. It felt like stone. The modern world had squeezed the air out of this soil, leaving it dead. He reached into the first glass vial, black mountain wheat. The grains were dark, almost ebony, and they felt heavy in his palm, like tiny lead weights of history. As he dropped the first seed into the dust, Elias felt a wave of doubt so cold it rivaled the ice house walls. "What if they're dead?" he whispered to the dark. "What if 80 years is too long for a heart to keep beating?" He covered the seeds. He watered them with the creek water, drop by drop, as if he were feeding a dying bird. For 7 days, nothing happened. The town watched from the road. People would slow their trucks, peering through the fence at the boy kneeling in the mud. They called him Crazy Silas's shadow. They waited for him to break. On the 8th morning, a storm rolled in, a violent Midwestern temper tantrum that lashed the ice house with hail. Elias stood at the window, watching his tiny plot of land being hammered by the sky. He felt the familiar sting of loss. Everything he tried to hold onto always seemed to be washed away. But when the clouds parted at noon and the steam began to rise from the black earth, Elias saw it, a sliver of green. It wasn't the pale, sickly green of the genetically modified corn in the neighboring fields. It was a deep emerald spear, sharp and defiant, then another, and another. By sunset, the extinct black mountain wheat had pierced the gray crust of the dead soil. The land wasn't dead. It was just waiting for someone who didn't want to exploit it. It was waiting for a caretaker who understood that growth isn't about profit, it's about survival. The word spread through the town like a brush fire. The old-timers, men who hadn't left their porch swings in a decade, began to show up at the fence. They recognized that shade of green. They remembered stories their fathers told them about wheat that grew 5 feet tall and tasted like honey and wood smoke. The narrative began to flip. Elias was no longer the orphan boy squatting on a developer's dream. He was the boy who had brought back a ghost. Miller didn't take the defeat lightly. If he couldn't use a bulldozer, he would use a briefcase. He filed a civil endangerment suit against Elias, claiming the ancient seeds were a biohazard and an invasive species that threatened the industrial crops of the surrounding county. He leveraged the fear of the local farmers, telling them that Elias' ancient weeds would cross-pollinate and ruin their contracts with the big seed companies. The hearing was held in the basement of the old courthouse, a room that smelled of floor wax and stale coffee. Elias sat at a small wooden table, alone. Across from him sat Miller and a team of 3 lawyers in charcoal suits. The judge, a woman named Sarah Thorne, looked tired. She had grown up in this town. She remembered the ice house when it was still functional. "Mr. Miller," Judge Thorne said, leaning over her bench, "you are asking this court to seize a private citizen's heritage and destroy biological samples that have been dormant for nearly a century. On what grounds?" Miller stood up, smoothing his tie. "Your Honor, we are a farming community. Our livelihood depends on consistency. This boy is playing scientist with ghost grains. If these seeds spread, our modern hybrids lose their value. He is an undocumented minor with no legal standing to manage a high-risk agricultural site. He is a danger to our economy." The room was silent. Elias felt the weight of 80 years of silence pressing down on him. He thought of the ledger. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a small, tattered photograph he'd found tucked in the back of Silas's diary. It was a photo of Silas and Miller's own father, standing together in 1939, holding a harvest of the very wheat Elias was growing. Elias stood up. He didn't look at the judge. He looked at the gallery of farmers sitting in the back of the room. "My grandfather didn't save these seeds to ruin your crops," Elias said, his voice carrying through the small room. "He saved them because he knew a day would come when your modern hybrids would fail. He knew the soil would get tired. He knew the chemicals would stop working." He held up the photo. "Mr. Miller's father knew it too. They were partners once. They were trying to protect the future of this county. But one of them chose the money and the other chose the ice house." A low murmur broke out among the farmers. They looked at the photo. They looked at Miller. They saw the greed in his eyes and they saw the truth in the boy's hands. Suddenly, an old man in the back, one of the old-timers who had been watching the fence, stood up. "I remember that wheat," he said, his voice gravelly. "My dad said it could grow in a desert and feed a village. Miller, you aren't protecting our crops. You're protecting your commissions from the chemical plant." One by one, the farmers stood up. It wasn't a riot, it was a realization. The orphan wasn't the outsider. The corporate developer was the outsider. The boy was the only one in the room who still had dirt under his fingernails. Judge Thorne slammed her gavel, but she was smiling. "Case dismissed." And Mr. Miller, "I suggest you move your SUVs off the ice house property before the sheriff finds a reason to tow them for trespassing on a sovereign heritage site." Elias walked out of that courthouse not as a ward of the state, but as a man. He had fought the world with nothing but a handful of dust and a memory, and for the first time in 16 years, he wasn't afraid of the cold. The harvest didn't come with the roar of a combine or the industrial efficiency of a corporate fleet. It came with the sound of 1,000 hand scythes and the low hum of voices in the early morning mist. When the Black Mountain wheat reached its full height, it was a sight that silenced the county. While the modern hybrid crops in the surrounding fields were struggling under a late summer drought, their stalks yellowed and brittle, Elias' plot was a sea of deep, midnight emerald. The ancient grains didn't just survive the heat, they seemed to thrive on it, drawing moisture from deep within the earth that the shallow-rooted miracle seeds of the big companies couldn't reach. The farmers who had once stood at the fence to mock now stood at the fence to learn. They came with their caps in their hands, asking Elias for a closer look. They rubbed the heavy, dark grains between their calloused palms, and smelled a scent they hadn't encountered since their childhoods. A rich, nutty aroma that spoke of minerals and life, not chemicals and salt. Elias didn't charge them a penny. He remembered the cold days in the ice house when he had nothing but a moth-eaten blanket. He remembered the feeling of being unwanted. He realized that the seeds were exactly like him, abandoned by a world that valued speed over soul, cast aside because they didn't fit a modern mold. "Take what you need for your own test plots," Elias told them. "Just promise me one thing. You don't sell the rights to a corporation. You keep the seeds in the family. You keep the lineage alive." That autumn, the ice house was no longer a tomb. It became a cathedral of commerce, but not the kind of commerce Miller understood. It was a trade of tradition. People brought jars of preserved peaches, hand-knit quilts, and help with the roof in exchange for a bag of the orphan's wheat. The structure that had been a fire hazard was now the most valuable building in 3 states. The most incredible moment came when the local bakery produced the first loaf of bread from the harvest. The entire town gathered in the square. When the first slice was cut, the steam carried an aroma that seemed to wake up the very spirit of the community. It was the taste of victory, not over a neighbor, but over the forgetfulness of time. Miller's SUVs were gone. His office in the city was closed. He had tried to buy the future, but he had forgotten that the past is rooted much deeper than any bank account can reach. Elias stood on the porch of the ice house, watching the townspeople share the bread. He wasn't the orphan anymore. He was the son of the soil. He had found his last name in the dust of a frozen floor. The ice house still stands today. If you drive through that small county, you'll see it. A massive, weathered wooden structure that looks like a sentinel guarding the valley. But it's no longer a place for ice. It is the Silas and Elias Heritage Trust, the largest independent seed vault in the country. Elias lived there for the rest of his long life, never once feeling the need to move into a modern mansion or a city penthouse. He found that when you have a purpose that is bigger than your own comfort, a drafty wooden building can feel like the warmest place on earth. But the real story isn't about the wheat, and it isn't about the money that the ghost grains eventually brought to the struggling county. It is about the invisible things we inherit. We live in a world that tells us that if something is old, it is useless. We are taught to chase the new, the fast, and the shiny. We are told that our value is based on what we can produce today, not what we have preserved from yesterday. We treat our history like a pile of dusty sawdust, something to be shoveled out and thrown away so we can build something productive on top of it. But Elias' journey teaches us a different truth. It teaches us that the things the world rejects are often the very things that will save us when the drought comes. Perhaps you feel like an orphan today. Perhaps you feel like you've been kicked out of a life you thought you deserved, left with nothing but a dusty ice house of a situation. You look at your inheritance, your family, your broken dreams, your meager talents, and you think it's just a pile of rot. But I want you to look closer. I want you to pick up the shovel. Underneath the dust of your disappointment, there is a vault. Inside that vault, there are seeds that were planted generations ago by someone who loved you before they even knew your name. There is a resilience in your bloodline that the modern world cannot understand. There is a black mountain wheat in your soul that can grow in the middle of a desert. Don't sign away your legacy for $500 and a quick exit. Don't let the Millers of the world tell you that your history is a fire hazard. The greatest treasures aren't found in the light. They are preserved in the dark, waiting for someone with the courage to break the seal. Your nothingness is actually your greatest strength, because when you have nothing, you are the only one who can truly appreciate the value of a single seed. Elias found a fortune in an ice house because he was the only one willing to stay in the cold long enough to find it. The question is, are you willing to stay? Are you willing to dig? Because the land is waiting, the ancestors are watching, and the truth is just beneath the sawdust.